My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we face the fearful fungus of Feast.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Feast is a 21-page mini hex crawl and mini dungeon delve where everything was done by Chris Bissett. It is largely system agnostic, although it assumes you are playing some kind of D&D-like game. A quote from the intro. Deep in the earth it slumbers, ancient, unknowable, patient. It inhales, tugging on the mycorrhizal networks that vein the land, pulling in everything it needs. Life, sustenance, people. There will be a ritual. The ancient thing will wake. There will be a feast.
Feast begins with a map of the hex crawl portion of the adventure, and from there we have a section detailing hooks you can use to work Feast into your campaign, or notes on how to kick off if you're playing it as a one-shot. Importantly, there is a fungal infection which is coercing one or more player characters to come to the adventuring location, which is this strange remote forest. From there, we have sections on getting started on the adventure, a table of random encounters, and a random weather table. Then comes a section called The Staging Ground, where an old log cabin houses a frenzied folk scholar, Amanya, and her collection of books, charts, and maps and other things that are strewn about the place. Next are descriptions of the 4 locations in the mini hex crawl. A logging camp where great violence has just occurred, a mushroom ring, a necromancer Gillen buried up to his neck, and a giant standing stone, beneath which is the entrance to the dungeon delve portion of the module. Solving the puzzle of how to gain access to this entrance is the principal activity of the hex crawl. Next is a map of the delve portion, which is presented here in a cutaway view. The delve consists of a random encounter table and 7 keyed locations, the last of which is the ritual chamber, where the player characters might be able to awaken the sleeping god Palunavegthi. The text ends with a trio of spells. Let's talk about our bona fides. Tom?
Well, I have none, really, because I have only read this. How about you?
I have played it in 2 sessions using Trophy Gold.
All right.
Things we liked. We both have notes on the sort of look of it in the presentation, so why don't we start there? I think the look and format are great. I famously, in my own publications, like a very clean, readable layout, and this delivers on that philosophy very well. I think the font choices are really good, actually.
Yeah,
the
nice,
margins are great.
Yeah, nice clear serif font, which is good one. Yeah.
The margins are really nice. Everything's laid out in a way that's very easy to find it when you need it. The margin notes are very helpful. I know you have a note about those.
Yeah, I like the marginalia. There's sort of not too much in the margins. And actually, the margin choices are a bit weird, but as soon as you realize that they are space for little frequently clickable asides from the author, then it all makes sense. And yeah, it's nice. It's not hard to navigate at all, which is pretty remarkable. And it seems characterful, like the notes are not uniformly placed, but they're just they just pop in and out. And that, I think, maybe is what stops it from being too plain, because it's largely unillustrated.
It is indeed, yeah. I just found the thing very easy and indeed a real pleasure to use in real time at the table. Things are linked nicely. It's just very easy to read. It's easy to find stuff. It was just a very good in-the-moment module to run. Other things in terms of production values, I think the writing is excellent here. I really love the writing. It isn't overwrought, but it still has a nice poetry to it, right? It still has a ring in the ear, which is really, really pleasant. And I think that's actually kind of hard to achieve. I think it's a credit to the module that, like you said, it doesn't have a lot of art, but nevertheless, I can visualize every part of it quite well just because of the quality of the text. I've got a couple of examples that I pulled out.
Sure.
So here's one of the weather entries. Flat gray light, the breeze dropping off to still. Temperature a degree or 2 above comfortable. An intake of breath, waiting. That's very poetic and vivid, but still tells you what you need to know about the weather at that
Yeah,
moment.
it's informative. It has sort of the cadence of, British and Irish listeners may be familiar with the BBC shipping forecast, which is like a radio thing that you can actually tune into and hear every night on the radio. And it also has that kind of slow thing. I also liked in the same table, there's something about, is it fat, slow rain, I think is one of them, which I think is wonderfully
right, yeah.
It's not a phrase I've ever really heard or read before, but I know exactly what it means. So yeah, and it's all like this, these sort of little, quite gentle in the way it portrays things. That's a bit of an odd word to use maybe, but it's like you say, it's not showy prose or poetry.
Right.
Yeah, it's sort of giving you the facts and then bringing with those facts just a little bit of slightly more vivid interpretation to nudge your mind's eye in the right direction, you know?
I think that's exactly right. The other one that I pulled out, which I think is a great example of what we're saying here about this god, Palunavegthi. The locals call the spirit Palunavegthi, but she believes it has a different name, she here being Amanya, a different older name that hasn't been touched by human tongues in a very long time. I love the visual of a name that hasn't been touched by human tongues. That's such an interesting way of putting it. It does a lot of work. That word choice does a lot of work to sort of like create like a particular tone and an understanding about the name of this entity, Palunavegthi, right? So the writing is quite good. I'll say here, in the interest of full disclosure, kind of, I guess, I have hired Chris for different writing projects, and the main reason why I hired them is because they're just a really good writer. And so you have that to look forward to in this.
It's great. And actually, I want to mention another thing, which is there is this sort of playfulness with language and alluding to older things. So there's a line that, I don't know if you've spotted this, which refers to the yaffle, yaffle, yaffle of green woodpeckers. And that is actually the term for the call of a woodpecker. And it's like when I was growing up, you would sometimes hear older people, and sometimes, you know, kids as well, refer to a woodpecker as a yaffle. It's like a kind of archaic word in English. And I think if you look in the very first pages, Chris talks about being inspired by, is it Wheatley, the director who, and things like A Field in England, which are these sort of Renaissance era, centuries ago settings. And so using these slightly archaic ways of speaking are bringing that through, that sense of oldness, which I think is very subtle but very good as well.
Absolutely. Let's talk about other things we liked about the module. Let's get into some of the substance of it. What do you think, Tom?
First off, I love the very clear instructions. Like, as you mentioned in Go Through the Contents, there's what to do if it's part of an ongoing campaign, how to deal with it if it's a one-shot, and that's just one paragraph each, but each one is nice and clear. TLDR, it's make sure you've set up the fungus thing.
Right, yeah.
Which is something I like, and maybe we'll come back and talk about that hook later. And similarly, there is the structure is you have, what is it? There are 4 labeled hexes, but a few sort of rando ones you might go into. Right, so you've kind of got a diamond of like, just a few hexes to crawl through. Then when you get to the dungeon delve part, that's below the middle. And the instructions for that are wonderfully straightforward. Here's how you set up. This is where you start. This is what you do next. But again, very economically done. And this is one of those modules where I read it and I think, this is interesting. I'd like to try this out. Even though I'm not very clear on what would necessarily happen. And maybe you can tell us a bit about what happened in your game later. But this is the kind of thing that gets me interested in playing it. Is like I read that description, I know what to do, and I immediately start imagining things that might happen. So that's, I think that's just really good in the way that, not just for marketing purposes, because it makes me want to do it, but because the life of an adventure exists before you start playing it, when you're just thinking about it, whether you're the GM and thinking about what might happen to the players, if you know you're going to be playing in it and you've maybe seen the cover and you're thinking, that's interesting, what's going to happen to my PC? So, that kind of instruction that really nails the core of what's going to happen roughly is really valuable.
It is, and you've hit on something which is a really terrific insight. I love this idea of the life of the module begins before you start playing it, like as you're reading it, because that has a bearing on your campaign. In my campaign, I knew Feast was coming while I was doing Trophy Gold. It's like an incursion or two before we actually played it. And so I was able to, having a clear understanding of how Feast was going to go and the themes it was going to deal with and the sort of basic through line of like events and encounters, I knew how to set it up. I could set it up in the previous incursions so that like when some of the big themes and ideas and encounters took place in Feast, it felt very, very cohesive and earned in the story. So stars, figure prominently in one of the hooks, the cosmology. And so that became kind of a thing I played with in earlier sessions. The idea of the fungal infection was something that I played with earlier. And so it's interesting. Chris gives this really great, this is how to do it if it's a one-shot, this is how to do it if it's a campaign. In both cases, it kind of hooks into this idea of the fungal infection. And that's actually one of the things I really love about the module. Those hooks are great. They are uniformly really good. And because it all sort of circles around this fungal infection, it's almost like a list of possibilities. It's like, okay, here's the fungal infection, and here are some different ways that might work for your game. And it just shows a sort of like openness and anticipatory sort of thinking, which I really appreciated. And I think it actually makes it pretty easy to work Feast into the campaign, I found. So I was very happy with that.
Yeah, because it can be difficult to seed that kind of thing in such a specific way.
Yeah.
For a one-shot, I guess it doesn't matter so much because you've got buy-in for this particular. We're going to the Fungus Forest. Yeah. As an Apocalypse World enjoyer, I'm a big aficionado of the horribly loaded sudden question. Which one of you owes a hideous amount of money to this terrible person? Yeah, that's fine. I'm good with that. But yeah, in an ongoing campaign, there is an extent to which this is, of course, a little bit coercive.
Sure.
Although, when you consider the number of curses or whatever that D&D PCs tend to pick up, it's probably fine. But I think there is a little bit of genius in here, which is interesting in the one-shot, but also softens the blow of you having the strange fungus curse drawing you to the forest. And that is this phrase, the forest teems with people drawn here. Now this, I think, is quite unusual. Normally when you're drawn by a strange prophetic dream or what have you to, like the tower in The Sea Queen Escapes, things like that, it's just you.
Right.
It's you and your friends, and you're in a big abandoned forest.
Yeah.
But in this one, you're kind of constantly bumping into weird, freaked out people who are also in this strange forest and also don't really know what's going on. Of course, that's more creepy, isn't it? Like it
gives the setup a sense of inevitability, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of what it wants. It makes it feel less coercive, and indeed, that's how it came off in my game as well.
You're not being picked on. It's happened to everyone, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very good.
I like the sort of overall structure of the hex crawl, then leading into the delve. The hex crawl portion is fundamentally, it's just a sort of narrative setup for the delve.
Yeah.
The things that are happening there literally funnel into the delve. But it feels great in play. In play, it has this really wonderful tension buildup. The players know that what they're doing is not the main thing because Amanya has already told them about the standing stone in the middle. They know that everything they're doing is sort of leading to something. It's very pregnant with tension and with portent, and that comes off great in play. And so that when you finally do the delve portion, it's like, oh, this is what we have been doing. This is what we're here to do. It's all building to this.
Can I ask you a bit about Amanya, actually? She seems like a very interesting NPC to have because she's a talkative NPC and tells you things, but she's not really there to help you at the staging ground. She's just kind of, she wants things. She wants to know things and demands things from you. How did your players react to that situation?
They loved her. She was probably of that first session, she was the highlight, in part because if I do say so myself, I'm pretty good at playing characters. So I was able to portray Amanya in a fun way. But also, it was interesting because I think it really helps to understand the nature of our party and why I chose Feast. 2 of the characters have backgrounds as lumberjacks. And so there's a whole lumberjack logging portion of the adventure, right? But another one is a scholar. So the party is essentially this scholar and her 2 heavies, essentially, right? And so this setup was great because the 2 more brawny dudes could go ahead of the cabin and scope things out, and they discover the logging camp and other things, while the scholar gets to hang back in the cabin and have ramblings and rantings with Amanya, right? And so for our particular party, it felt good in play, and that character was fun to play. I like that it's framed as the staging ground because what it's doing is it's injecting you into the story, right? Yeah. It's okay, you're here and you're now being injected into the story. Here are the things you need to know. And you know some things, now you know some more things, and now go get to it. It feels good. It was a great character. The delve itself is very fun. It has this nightmarish quality, I think, is what we're landing on here.
I thought that as well. Not on a read. It doesn't feel like a dreamscape to me, but lots of the imagery and sensations in there feel like something you would encounter in a dream.
Yeah.
Is that accurate, do you think?
Yeah, we had kind of we had kind of like a Trophy Gold specific problem because the adventure has very little treasure in it. And so the players they had like sort of more immediate concerns by the time we got to the delve of like, oh shit, we need to like find some treasure. There's no treasure. Right. Yeah. And so that was maybe kind of like what was in their mind in the beginning. I agree that on a read, it has that feel. The whole thing is the delve is essentially like biological metaphor for the creature that's at the end, right? The Paluna Veg, the god thing. And so like a cavern full of razor sharp shards is like the mouth or whatever, right? It has that feeling. It almost has the feeling of taking like a natural environment and then layering on top of it your natural human fears, and then layering on top of that what you know about the place, that it's like there's this like sleeping god. And so in a sense, you can imagine how your characters would interpret this space as a sort of like natural nightmare. And I think the text conveys that pretty well. Interestingly, and this is one of my questions, which we'll get to in the questions portion, there's almost no combat. And so it's really all about vibes. Okay. So you have to be ready to do that. But I think it does a good job of conveying that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that sense of menace is prefigured. Well, like you said, the Hexcrawl is a good on-ramp to the delve. Like, one of my favourite images in it is a necromancer. I think the guy is buried up to his neck.
Gillen, yeah.
Yeah. Great. All I can picture now is Aidan Gillen, the actor, but that's probably not what's being shot for there. I love that because it's such an iconic image in a sort of comical Wild West kind of thing. You know, someone's been buried up to their neck in the sand, but that is a very oniric image in itself. And so this guy, he's sort of being figuratively swallowed by the earth as well.
I never thought of that, but that's right.
Have you ever seen that Samuel Beckett play? Where they made a TV version of it once with Alan Rickman and Kristen Scott Thomas and I forget who the third was, where just these sort of three characters kind of in some purgatory, they're all buried up to their necks in pots of soil.
I know of this. Yeah.
It's called Play, I think. And it made me think of that, you know, in both the delve and Gillen outside in the above ground. So yeah, I think actually this idea of seeding things goes all the way from the intro right through the Hexcrawl into the delve. And of course, ironically, that's what the fungus has been doing to your player characters earlier on as well. So it all works nicely together.
Does indeed, yeah. That's all I had in terms of things I like. Just overall, a really great horror module. Did you have any other things you want to point out?
No. I mean, you mentioned you have a question or two, or
I do. Yeah. Why don't we go to questions? So, as I noted, the module does indeed have very little combat, instead relying on sort of these nightmarish set pieces for its tension and its drama. Now, as an old story gamer who uses systems where combat is de-emphasized anyway, that works really great for me. I'm curious if you think there's enough to do here in a more traditional D&D-ish system.
My instinctive answer is yes, when I'm thinking of OSR-ish games, like even in my ongoing DCC game where we're at the moment approaching the heady heights of levels 2 and 3. Even so, there's the pattern tends to be this very cautious, don't get into fights with monsters, let's be really careful checking around corners point of view. I think maybe in something like Pathfinder or modern D&D, you could be right. Maybe it wouldn't be fulfilling the promise of those systems, which is that you'll get to use those things on your character sheet. But I think if you look at the whole sort of Mud and Blood OSR stuff, I think it would be fine in this.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I haven't played those games very much, so I think I'm just kind of missing some context. What I did is I put the combat encounters in the blank hexes, so I just had something prepared for the blank hexes that was a fight, basically, right? Just so they have a little bit of fight to do. But okay, great. Well, why don't we go ahead and go to the Chain Lightning round? Tom.
Take the bone knife. It is yours now. Nobody will take it from you. You'll need it beneath the standing stone. When you carve the symbols into flesh and complete the ritual must be completed. There must be a feast.
A fat brown bear stripping berries from branches. He is hungry and definitely not your friend. The fur around his shoulders is spotted with white fungus, spores drifting into the air behind him.
Passages between rooms are tight earthen tunnels, barely wide enough for characters to fit. You're crawling, writhing, squeezing, not walking.
3 mercenaries, deserters all. One lies bound on the ground while the others stitch crude shapes into their flesh.
The negative space compresses and fills with dirt, like the tunnels and rooms never existed. You feel what it's like to drown in earth. Then it passes, and reality returns.
Fresh stumps and fallen trunks, the air thick with sawdust and sap, a pair of tents, crushed and torn apart and left to the elements. Warm blood dripping from leaves, soaking the earth and turning the soil black. Strings of wet flesh strung delicately between branches. Let's go to the expert delve. The Between Ghosts of El Paso is now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Ghosts of El Paso is a new campaign for the Between role-playing game. It's about a group of ghost hunters, the Vigilance Committee, in the township of El Paso, Texas in the late 19th century, after the war but before the first railroad came through. The Vigilance Committee is dealing with the effects of the Wounded Night, a seasonal phenomenon in El Paso that takes place in the fall every 6 years, during which time the veil between the land of the living and the land of the dead is thinned. The hunters learn about various ghostly threats around El Paso and conduct investigations in order to neutralize those threats. Over time, they become aware of the plans of a criminal mastermind who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. The hunters will eventually be forced to confront this mastermind in order to save their community. The Between Ghosts of El Paso is inspired by Western films and TV shows such as Deadwood, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, The Quick and the Dead, and Unforgiven. It also takes inspiration from Texas folklore and urban legends, as well as the music of Johnny Cash and other artists. You can get The Between Ghosts of El Paso by making a $6 pledge to the Gauntlet Patreon. Your pledge not only gets you access to the latest releases from Gauntlet Publishing, but also supports everything we create in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. So go to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. It's the Expert Delve. Our topic today is entitled, So You've Summoned an Elder God.
We've all done it.
We've all been there, right? Yeah. The end of Feast presents the possibility of awakening the sleeping god, Pablo Navegthi. And if the player characters do so, we are told, quote, the GM will decide what this means. And that's it. Now, I think the idea here is that you know better what will work for the tone and story of your campaign than Chris Bissett does, and so we'll leave that part to you. I can't exactly fault it because my own game, Brindlewood Bay, does more or less the same thing. The midwives might summon a monstrous child of Persephone, and it's the job of the keeper to say what that means. Although I will note, the new version of the game that just came out has much more guidance on that matter than the old version did. I thought it would be fun and possibly helpful to run through some ideas of how your campaign world might react should an elder god be summoned. This is a thing that is frequently implied as a possibility in many role-playing games, especially fantasy and Lovecraftian ones, dark fantasy at least. But you rarely get much advice on how to GM that, right? Like, it's always like a possibility that an ancient elder, great old one thing might rise up, but that's kind of where they leave you, very frequently. Yeah. So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
I think I want to start with building up to the moment that the elder god is summoned. So before you even get to the point where either the villains of the story summon the elder god, or maybe you yourselves as the player characters accidentally summon the elder god or intentionally summon the elder god, building up to that moment I think is important. So in Feast, the summoning of Pablo Navegthi seems like something the player characters just sort of stumble into, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think you can kind of plan ahead if you want to center Pablo Navegthi in your campaign. So maybe the fungal infection is an ongoing problem in the campaign prior to Feast. You could even have some maybe mushroom-focused modules as a sort of thematic buildup. Mm-hmm. Goodness knows the OSR has no shortage of...
Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, that or cockroach people.
Exactly right, yeah. Maybe there's an evil cult or a group of mad scholars, maybe a Manya's group running around whispering about Pablo Navegthi. The most important question is, why do this? Basically, it just raises the narrative stakes of the game. When it comes time to actually do the thing, it feels like a big, impactful, earned moment. What are your thoughts just about building up to it?
It's what gets you away from that kind of the monster of the week feel, which of course is perfectly valid storytelling feel, but it's one that is fun in many ways because it doesn't have that much impact. It's like, this time we didn't defeat that vampire very effectively, but next week we're going to fight a werewolf and it'll be fine. But doing this reincorporation I think it's always worth doing because it makes your ongoing game feel more cohesive.
Yes.
And therefore more worthwhile, investing in the characters. The PCs aren't the only real people in the setting. There are other things going on. And also it's quite easy to do, right? A fungal infection, people saying, oh, I've got a nasty rash recently, and then seeing that around a bit. You don't need to make a big thing of it necessarily. It's just the same as maybe mentioning far off cities that are in your setting during some sessions, and maybe in a later session you'll go to one of them and maybe you won't, and either way that's okay. But then if you do go to something that got mentioned earlier, or if you do end up dealing with the slumbering god beneath the earth, like you say, it feels earned. It feels like it's not just being, I've got this adventure and we're going to do it today. It feels like the culmination of a thing, for sure.
I can see a certain type of pleasure or enjoyment out of, oops, we summoned an elder god, right? Coming out of nowhere. I think it has the potential of feeling too sudden in your campaign, or clashing in a way that's not going to feel good.
I mean, even in that case, I think I would want it to be established that there are such things as elder gods that one might accidentally summon. Like, even if you hadn't done anything else with it after that, you couldn't just be playing something like maybe Pasión de las Pasiones, and then suddenly there's an elder god in it. Bad example.
I want to play that, actually. In Brindlewood Bay, it was really important for me that the final encounter with the cult and the potential of the child of Persephone being summoned did not feel like it came out of nowhere. It was really important that even in the early stages of the campaign, when it's just focused on cozy murder mysteries, I wanted it to be like a drumbeat in the background. Like, it was a thing that had to, it's a possibility, and we know it's a possibility, and indeed it feels like a possibility. Getting into some more like specific thoughts here, I actually think the presence of an evil cult in the campaign is a really fabulous way of creating a thematic through line for the elder god and for making that moment feel earned. Like, an evil cult is particularly good. I mean, it's basically what the Enemy Within does in a lot of ways.
You're right. Although the Enemy Within actually has is a very effective way of doing it, because that's a kind of low effort way. There's actually several different cults, and the one that you have the climactic showdown with at the end is unrelated to the one that you had all the business with the ear pulling and nose touching. Yeah. But it still works because you're aware that they're more or less pushing in the same direction. And of course, it gives you the opportunity to have some, in a big long campaign like The Enemy Within, to have some early victories where you actually deal with and wipe out the cult. But then there are more around. And so it still feels like it's gradually escalating, even though maybe you've dispatched the first problem, like having a big bad at the end.
Also, it sort of introduces the possibility that the player characters could have stopped all this earlier. If we know there's an evil god or an evil cult and they're trying to summon this god and they're kind of always there, they're doing different things. Maybe you have a couple of adventures where you face off against them directly. There's this thought that, well, we could have done something before it got to this point. Of course they're going to summon an evil god, and maybe we could have done something about it, even if there was never a realistic possibility, because of the way campaigns and GMs work. At least it sort of feels like they could have. And I think that sort of grounds the whole thing and makes it feel like more believable. Caveat for talking about believability in fantasy adventure games.
Quote believable,
yeah. Speaking of thematic through lines, I think a regular theme or motif helps with this sense of earning the big elder god moment. If you have an elder god who their followers carve out their own eyes or something, having the motif of eyes, or like bandaged up eyes, or being able to see things or not see things, you can kind of like pepper those things into the campaign, and in a way that where it's almost operating on like a subconscious level. That's old religion here at Fear of a Black Dragon, but it's worth pointing out.
And it's worth pointing out that you can create your own schemes for this as well. So like if you see a movie like Memento, right, all the flashbacks are in black and white and the present day stuff is in colour. That's not a film convention. It's not any time we see something in black and white, it's definitely a flashback. But after you've done it twice watching the film, you know the system. Similarly, but more subconsciously, you can do that with your symbols for the cult. It would be good to have motifs for other things, I guess, as well, so that it's not too obvious. When something evil cult related is happening, have that eye symbolism. Start talking about people's eyes in your narration, even if it's not like a physical thing that's happening particularly differently in the real world. Just suddenly start talking about eyes and things like that. And as you say, it works on a subconscious level, And also, it's just fun to play with because you get to create your own weird little kind of Godfather-style oranges equal death motif, and maybe no one will really notice it until the very end, and then that's kind of a big reveal as well, right? Because suddenly it'll be, that's why he kept having people winking at us when we walked past. That kind of thing.
It's the payoff.
It's fun,
it's totally earned. All right, let's talk about different types of Elder God situations.
All right.
I think probably the most maybe obvious one, I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but the one that a lot of people are going to think about is the Elder God in question triggers an apocalypse. Their appearance in the world just ruins everything, right? Which is probably what the evil cult wanted. But what does that mean? What does it mean at the campaign level, like the meta level? And what does it mean like in the story, like actually in the setting? I think these are really interesting questions. And I pondered it for a while because there's a part of you who just wants to be like, well, it all goes to shit and that's the end of the campaign, right?
I mean, yeah, which is maybe the easiest and best answer in some ways.
In some ways, yeah. That's it. But maybe we want to go beyond that, right? And see and entertain possibilities beyond that. But kind of to what you're saying, though, I think as a threshold matter, did the player characters even survive the summoning? Like, should they be able to survive? If there's this all-consuming cataclysmic monstrosity that can't even kill the people right in front of them, maybe it's not as powerful as we think. Right?
Yeah,
like maybe it's not as big a moment as we think.
Maybe at best they could just see it happen from far away, and then that would explain it. Yeah. But my inclination would just be to, I don't know, maybe I've run a lot of Call of Cthulhu, but I would just kill all of them and keep going with new pieces.
Be like, yeah, that was my thought too. I mean, it's probably best to have a big stop at the campaign, like a season, conclusion or something. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of restart with brand new characters who are dealing with the fallout. Unless there's some reason why the player characters would have survived it. Like you said, like they were not nearby when it happened. Yeah. They were they're just aware of it generally. That's different. But if they're like right there, I feel like they need to be dead.
Yeah, probably they should not make it through. Yeah. I think it depends a lot which point you feel you're at in the campaign. Like, is it going to be the cataclysm happens and then you have a sort of epilogue where we see the beginning of like a new saga happening? Or is it more like, if you have your cataclysm happen very early on, then you've kind of got the Mad Max franchise, the first movie where cities still exist and things are kind of normal. Mm-hmm. And then there's the whatever happens between that and Mad Max 2. And you've still got the same lead character, but he's now living in this strange world with feral children and thunderdomes and so on. Yeah, I suppose that's an important question is, what if it's exactly halfway through? That's a really interesting thing as well.
That's the hard one.
That's the hardest one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you probably want to consider carefully about how much more of this you think there's going to be. Is it the beginning or the end? Yeah.
You definitely have to be ready to make some pivots. If it's something that happens in the beginning, in some sense, you're almost doing like the before times in flashback, right? Like you're your middle. I actually don't know what to do about the middle. I mean, that feels so disruptive, but who knows? Maybe that's where our advice is coming in here in a bit. The end really feels like, okay, we end this chapter of the campaign and we start something. If we want to keep going, we flash forward. We fast forward into the future to kind of deal with the fallout and what all that means, whether it's the same characters or not. Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold do this in some fun ways because some of the Trophy Gold incursions actually deal with the fallout of certain events in the Trophy Dark incursions, right? So you have these like Trophy Dark characters who die at the end or whatever, they're no longer a thing. And then we have the Trophy Gold incursion, which is like the companion piece that is sort of like, okay, this is what happened after and what we had to do. It's not really like apocalyptic scale events, but they're big deal events. So that's something you might consider too, is maybe you do like a funnel, or maybe where like the hapless funnel characters accidentally summon the Elder God if you're trying to plan ahead.
Yeah.
Maybe you do like a prologue type story before we get to that point, and then the actual campaign is the characters who pick up the pieces, So anyway, just different ideas. I think it might be worth talking about, I have just a list here of possible setting problems, world problems, because this terrible god is here now and has ruined everything. Dramatic shift in weather and increased natural disasters. That's a thing that people are going to have to deal with. The very heavens could change, like the sun, the moon, the stars, which could have an effect on all sorts of campaign world things like magic, the availability of food, the tides, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I've used that when I've had the Apocalypse World thing where they activated the thing and now there are two suns. And that's dramatic as well, because that's really... if you're doing the stop now and we'll do another season later, that's a great cliffhanger thing to end on. Like, this used to be a frozen wasteland, but now you see flowers growing.
Drama. Yeah.
End of session. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Let's have a 2-month break. So yeah, that's a good scale of images to use for that kind of thing.
Well, and like thinking of a few steps ahead in terms of, well, relatively speaking, like in terms of decades or years or whatever, like how has the world changed? That's a fun exercise, right? It's a fun way of thinking about your campaign world. New strange monstrosities ripping through the fabric of time and space. Mm-hmm. It's a video game, but Elden Ring is really good at this. Spoilers for Elden Ring. You have all these like sort of mundane-ish creatures in the setting, which were clearly there before the ancient alien space god landed, it's a literal alien. But then you have all this like weird shit too. And the weird shit is like trapped. It's a strange multi-limbed alien neon thing that just happened to land in this cave and can't get out now. Right? Like, and so it's just sort of like trying to live its life in this cave and you just run into it. That kind of thing happening in the setting is really fun, like sort of playing with this idea of new alien creatures. Other problems, refugees. This is a theme that we don't do much in fantasy campaign games. This is more of a story gamer kind of thing, but I love the idea of telling stories about refugees and what that means. Political turmoil, obviously revolving around the entity, whatever political structures are even left. This is one that I got from somebody on Twitter. Somebody said, new parts of the world opening up because the land has changed. That's an interesting idea.
And currently happening in the real world as well, with the Northwest Passage.
Right, exactly, yeah. But it's an interesting idea, though, right? It's like something about the weather or the heavens changed, and it caused like a new part of the world to open up. Well, what does that mean? It's just something else to consider and ponder. A person on Twitter called Rat King RPGs had an interesting idea about how you sort of repurpose the typical dungeon fantasy crawl game to be an apocalypse or post-apocalyptic environment. In particular, I like the idea of dungeons as bomb shelters.
Yeah, because if you play Fallout, that's kind of what the bomb shelters are, isn't it? You lived in one when you were a kid, and then you go outside, and then when you find more shelters, they kind of are dungeons. And dungeons as bomb shelters has sort of been done in Earthdawn as well. But the idea is that there were these big monstrosities, the horrors, I think they're called. Never read or played it. This is all secondhand, but which kind of scoured the earth, and humans had to hide underground in what are now dungeons.
Yeah,
and then that's the whole reason that D&D style adventuring is happening in the setting, is because the apocalypse has sort of ebbed away, and people are now emerging and exploring what was left behind. So yeah, bomb shelters, and just the idea. Well, the nuclear apocalypse is as much an unleashed monstrosity as Shub-Niggurath or whoever. So
yeah. Well, this person on Twitter had also this interesting idea of your priest's like typical warding magic being used not to keep monsters at bay necessarily, but to create perimeters for the survivors and dealing with other like survivors. And I thought that was an interesting idea. I think it's really important to point out that as we have sadly learned in the real world in the year 2022, a surprising number of people will make peace with the situation and start following this new terrible god out of expediency, out of like personal gain.
Yeah.
And that's an intriguing idea. Although I think that's probably more salient in the next thing I want to talk about. So.
Okay, yeah. Because I was going to say that sort of recalls things like the, your Dark Sun Sorcerer Kings or something like that. There's a big monstrosity or some powerful figure that can compel you. So do you kind of volunteer before you're compelled and that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah. So the next thing, my next bin here is the god is powerful, but it is physically small, or it's not generally visible, or the effects are not immediately visible. You have sort of like Sauron in the years before The Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. They're very, very powerful, but sort of creeping about, causing trouble, putting things in place, manipulating kingdoms and doing all that kind of stuff, right? I think this is like the more interesting possibility in terms of having an ongoing campaign than the sort of like Cthulhu rising up out of the ocean. Like, I think this is the more interesting possibility, this sort of powerful god that is creeping about, going here and there, or whatever they say about Sauron, right? What do you think?
Yeah, no, this is very workable, and I'm thinking immediately of Mutant Chronicles, the massive shoulder pads based sci-fi game, which I wrote some supplements for the 3rd edition. And the backstory to that is, and indeed I think one of the first scenarios you can play is an expedition to not Pluto, but the planet beyond that, and where basically some meddling corporate types open up the 3rd seal of repulsion or whatever it is and unleash this dark is it the Dark Symmetry, the bad force is called? And then, about, decades later, centuries, the main setting has this sort of enemy within. They have undead legions having actual fights on Mars against big armies, but they also have this insidious evil that infects technology and affects people's minds and so on, and has cultists and evil ninjas. To be honest, there's not much point listing everything that's in the Mutant Chronicles setting because everything is in it. But it has exactly that kind of thing of the menace starts out relatively small and it's sort of brought back Event Horizon style by these guys that went and opened the wrong thing. So totally workable and actually very flexible for doing, like we were just talking about, at any point of the campaign, right? You could start off with that whole, to put it back to a fantasy thing, perhaps you're part of rival bands seeking some lost treasure, and maybe some of you are aware that in the vein of the movie Aliens, that treasure is going to be very dangerous when you bring it back, but you want to do it anyway, or someone wants to do it anyway, they don't want to destroy it. And then at some point, of course, it's going to escape. That seems inevitable. And then, you've got that scenario, haven't you? And it could be a more sort of Manchurian Candidate, brainwashing, Red Scare kind of plot, or it could be, it could just be big gribbly aliens with tentacles that burst out of nowhere. Depending on what you want,
Well, I think the key is that, like, the Elder God in this case works more subtly, right? I mean, that's really the key here. In this sense, they almost become more of like a grand antagonist to the player characters than a sort of necessarily a world-ending monstrosity. And I think the important part, as you've alluded to, the disruption to your ongoing campaign doesn't have to be that great. Right? This is much easier to work in. I think that's important. But the stakes are still really high, though, right? Like, the stakes are still very high. They're just high in a different way.
Yeah, because, I mean, to give... I'll give an example. Spoilers here, everyone, for the end of the Masks of Nyarlathotep campaign for Call of Cthulhu. Masks has an ending that is, in some ways, a massive cop-out, in other ways is kind of satisfying. And that is that towards the end, you either will or won't foil the cult that's trying to... I forget what they're doing. It's something to do with a rocket. It's going to be bad. And, of course, the game is set in, like, the early to mid-1920s, and that's important. So if you succeed in foiling the cult, everything is fine, and history proceeds as we remember it. But if you fail, then they're successful, and this dark, evil power comes into the world, and then within 10 years, there's a horrible global war, and all kinds of suffering is enacted, or in other words, history unfolds as we remember it. That ending, if you have that, of course, relies on the "we could have done something about it" thing that you mentioned earlier. Yeah. But my point in this case is, that's literally zero disruption to your campaign. It's the campaign you were going to do anyway, which I feel in this case is not... I don't know, it goes against my GMing ethics, but I do sort of admire its sneakiness. So, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that one, but... it's a very manageable apocalypse in that way.
Yeah. What are the implications of the Elder God in question being good? Imagine if we're talking about D&D alignment. It's like some lawful good god is sort of like suddenly physically manifest in the world because of something, and now they're sort of like reigning over everything. It's not interesting if the campaign just becomes a sort of grand utopia and we're done, right? I mean, they're
I don't know. People say Blue Rose is playable. I've never tried it myself, but you can have that. Suddenly there's a beacon of light, I suppose. That would be presumably a change from, well, it'd certainly be a change from your normal fantasy campaign, Jason.
Certainly mine, but,
I think it's doable, but it does seem less exciting as an outcome.
In some sense, it actually might be the most horrible outcome of all, because you can imagine, and I think if this is what happens in your game, you should, as a GM, or if you're writing an adventure or a campaign, you should consider this approach, which is probably elements of quite extreme fascism rise up, right? In the case of where we have this like good God, because now suddenly it becomes about imposing on people what we think the ideals of this God are, or the behaviors that this God wants to see us do. I'm assuming this was something that happened in comic books at some point. We published a game that was like this, where basically the Superman type character is essentially given like control over a very muscular UN. And what does it mean for Superman to be in charge of everything? Well, it has implications. It doesn't just lead to like peace, it leads to fascism. And so what do you think about that as a sort of way of having stakes still?
I think that's a very interesting setting to be in, possibly frustrating at times, but that is very interesting. But you could also take it at kind of face value and have this new good avatar exist, but then have people acting in what they think they're supposed to be doing, and kind of disagreeing
Right.
about that, and and just getting it wrong. I think that would be also pretty good. But I think much like if you've got a massive evil being over in Mordor, you don't want to have too much of the action happening close to the throne. Probably in the same way, you don't want to be sort of hanging around the Celestial Palace all the time. I think you'd want to have your game be on the peripheries of that, where people can get into these arguments about what's to be done about the as yet unexpressed will of the great angel that showed up last week, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I do want to end our discussion here by talking particularly about Cthulhu Mythos settings or Lovecraftian games and settings like Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu Dark, that kind of thing. I think the campaign is basically over. It's like a fail state in Cthulhu Dark and Call of Cthulhu or similar games, right? Like where the evil god's here, and now it's done. Like you can't fight it, can you? I mean, I know you can in like board games like Arkham Horror or whatever.
Sure. Well, it's not exactly a fail state in a Graham Walmsley style purist adventure, because you were headed that way anyway.
You're right. A fail state.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But
for the characters, it's a fail state. Exactly. It's a win state for the players, right?
Oh, sure. But I think that there are a few different things you can do with that. Mechanically speaking, in BRP D100 Call of Cthulhu, you kind of can fight the monsters, if you're far enough away, doing different things. But like in practical story terms, I think what you'll commonly find is that, when the Starspawn of Cthulhu rise up, it's usually done a bit localized, so that all of those investigators can get wiped out on an island in the Pacific, but the rest of the world usually continues blissfully unaware. That tends to be the model, I think, which is, I think, reasonably satisfying, because it means you can have effectively the same campaign setting but new investigators. But if you're going proper world ending, I think at that point you fade to white, or you do depressing epilogues.
You have great epilogues,
which I think is what Soth does, the story game about summoning a dark god. I'm pretty sure you do that kind of advancing through time, what happens to each of the characters. Just get the players to fill it in at that point, or just go full The Sopranos on it and just do a big cataclysmic ending scene and put a full stop on it. For that kind of game, I think in many ways that's really what you want. You don't want to necessarily start picking through the ruins and kind of turning it into Fallout. Although the idea of a sort of 1930s set Fallout with a history professor and a private detective does seem quite interesting as well.
Indeed. Well, let's go to our next segment. It's the companion adventures, and we have a lot of books today. I'm actually going to start, though, with a thing that's not in my notes, which is a podcast, because I just re-listened to it literally the last few weeks. It has been named now the Lovecraft Investigations. It's the BBC audio podcast.
Yes.
Great series. Really, really good. 3 seasons. I just listened to the 3rd season for the first time, and I had previously listened to the other 2 seasons before. Yeah. But I re-listened to the whole thing, and it's really great. And what I love about it is, there's a lot to love about it, but it's important for companion adventures because the whole thing is what we've been talking about in the Expert Delve. It's about this cult that's been operating in the background. They're always kind of there. Even when we have these like more discrete stories, that cult is still there doing its thing. And then it's all about summoning this thing at the end.
Yeah.
So just great production values, great voice acting. It's worth your time.
Completely. Yeah, I actually found out that supposedly there are even connections from that series to other podcasts by the same people, other radio dramas.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's all a thing. Although, I mean, I like it less now that I know that, because the other ones are not really Lovecraftian enough to match, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But really good. Especially that first season, I think, is
I think the first one's probably the best. Yeah.
Horror stuff. Yeah, it's fabulous.
Let's do some of these books now.
Okay.
Why don't you start?
Sure. I'll go with my game one first that I just mentioned at the tail end there, which is Soth. Hail Soth. In Soth, you play cultists in a small town trying to summon a dark god, and if you complete 3 more rituals after the start of the game, it normally takes 1 to 2 sessions, Soth will rise. But you've got to conceal all the murderous crimes you're doing from your family and friends. Because it's a story game, there's a sort of mid-game twist that usually shows up as the squabbling hierarchy. Basically, it's like if the PTA tried to organise a black mass. So it's it's described as a mix between Breaking Bad and H.P. Lovecraft. It's by Steve Hickey, and I recommend it. I've played it a couple of times, and I've enjoyed it both times. So
I've played it 3 or 4 times. It's great.
yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
I have novels. I'm going to go with The Fisherman from 2016. I'm trying not to be too spoilery, but The Fisherman is an excellent book for one thing. It's a very, very fresh take on like this sort of Lovecraftian story. So that's one reason to read it. If you're just kind of ready for, you want that kind of story, but you want like a kind of a newer sort of thing, a newer storytelling approach, this is a really good one. But I've chosen it here because it has what is probably my favorite textual depiction of summoning an ancient god. Is just so good and so vivid, and it's almost like procedural, and it feels so great. And every now and then I have these like moments in media where someone like takes the idea and then portrays the idea in a way that is very vivid, and you think, wow, that's the way it should be. I'm thinking of like how the HBO TV show Rome portrays like pagan god worship. Every now and then, like someone takes an idea that we all know about or think of and like depicts it in a way that is very exciting. And that's what The Fisherman does with summoning Lovecraftian monstrosities. So that's my first book recommendation.
Okay, I'll jump in with Stealing Cthulhu by the aforementioned Graham Walmsley. So this is a guide to creating scenarios, many of which involve summoning dark gods. The central idea is that by stealing and adapting and like recombining different ideas from Lovecraft, you can create scenarios that are not kind of retreading the same material, but they are utilizing the same structures and textures to have the same kind of cosmic horror feeling. And it includes the rules to Cthulhu Dark if you don't already have a copy somehow. So yeah, really good read, and I think, quite illustrative as well. By looking at what Graham's done with the works of Lovecraft, if you wanted to try and do something similar yourself to work on a different genre, you can kind of see how he's done it and attempt a similar thing in a different field as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I consider it a seminal work in our space. It's very, very good.
Yeah.
I have Mexican Gothic, the novel from 2020. It would be too spoilery for me to say why this is the case, but let me just assure you, it is a fantastic companion adventure for Feast in particular, for several big reasons. But staying away from that stuff, I'll just say that the book is really beautifully written. It's a great remixing of the classic British Gothic horror novel, and totally worth your time. It's a quick read too. You can knock it out in a couple sittings. I also have Ghost Story, the 1979 book by Peter Straub, his first published book, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I like that because in our Expert Delve discussion, we talked about this idea of like the ancient entity subtly affecting a community and subtly worming its way into causing trouble. And that's what's happening in this book. And so that's why I've chosen it.
All right.
And listeners, that is our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. Our website is gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, as ever, to our infectious editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, dear listener, for listening. Take care.
Take care.